Hey everyone, welcome back. So we are going to finish up the first chapter of The Disappearance of Rituals by Byung-Chul. So we're on page 11. We just have a couple more pages, so this video won't be as long. The next chapter this chapter, just to remind you, is called The Compulsion of Production, and how production, capitalism, kind of relates to his ideas of rituals or the lack thereof. The next chapter is called The Compulsion of, I don't know if you can see that, Authenticity, which we're definitely going to go and read together because I think it's really interesting. If I remember, he's critiquing authenticity, since that is what Heidegger is all about, and I'm also reading Being in Time. So, all right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. If you want a summary of this book, you can reference it in my previous videos. So we left off with a sentence on page 11: likes, friends, and followers do not provide us with resonance. And so just to remind you what he means by resonance is this sounds not a narcissistic sort of echo, but something more relational. They only strengthen the echoes of the self. All right. Rituals are processes of embodiment and bodily performances. In them, the valid order and values of a community are physically experienced and solidified. And so this is interesting because there's a tradition of philosophy that is highly rationalistic and sort of privileges the mind over the body. For instance, certain existentialists will not talk so much about bodily freedom, but propose the idea that if you are free in your mind, then no one can take that from you. Which of course can be complicated, right, by the idea of brainwashing and psychological coercion and abuse. But here, this is one thing that focusing a return to the body and material kind of situations is something that feminist existentialists have really taken up and said, hey, let's remember this. So Byung-Chul is also doing it. They are written into the body, incorporated, that is physically internalized. Thus, rituals create a bodily knowledge and memory, an embodied identity, a bodily connection. A ritual community is a communal body, and there is a bodily dimension inherent to community. To the extent that it exerts a disembodying influence, digitalization weakens common ties. Okay, to the extent that it exerts a disembodying influence, digitalization weakens common ties. Digital communication is disembodied communication, which it is. Sorry. So, it may be time for this message, right? For the pendulum to swing back this way. I mean, I think that, this is sort of the crisis of isolation and then the lack of sort of meaningful, real connection that we get online. I mean, sometimes it's really helpful, right? If it's the only thing we have. But how does it disembody us? Like, are we aware of our bodies, of our situatedness, of our physicality, weight, space that we take up when we participate in technological ventures? Ritual acts also include feelings, but the bearer of these feelings is not the isolated individual. In a ritual of mourning, for instance, the mourning is an objective feeling a collective feeling? It is impersonal. Collective feelings have nothing to do with individual psychology. So you think about, like in classical Greek times with the theaters and the tragedies, um, the chorus was sort of emulating the mourning and the fears and the discomfort and the pain that the collective audience um, could access, sort of a mode of catharsis by watching and participating in, and all the community comes to the forum to watch this presentation, right, or this performance. And it's kind of connected to this, what Byung-Chul Han is saying. In a ritual of mourning, the community is the actual subject that mourns. Faced with the, and you can think about the comfort that we might have, suffering together. Faced with the experience of loss, the community imposes the mourning upon itself. Such collective feelings consolidate a community. The increasing atomization of society also takes hold of its emotional world. So then we're going back, he kind of switches back and forth to the ideal and the current reality. So he would call what is happening today an atomization, kind of a disintegration of the whole, of the one, of the unified collective, into atoms, or separate individuals, points. The formation of collective feelings becomes less frequent. Instead, fleeting affects and emotions, the states of isolated individuals predominate. Unlike emotions and affects, feelings can be collective. Digital communication, however, is predominantly affect-based. Okay, so I was pausing a little bit. I feel like there might be a need for a justification or a little bit of a clarification. Why are we using the word emotions and affects as something that cannot be collective? Why is feelings the word we choose for the collective? These are things sometimes that I wish authors would not just brush by and so we just have to accept it without thinking about it. I wish they would explain word choices. And that's what I was getting tripped up, I realized, with the Kierkegaard quote, because he quoted this, 3 or 4 sentences of Kierkegaard, which is fine. We understand what Kierkegaard's intent is, but he only discussed part of the quote. And as I would tell my students, if you're going to quote something, you need to discuss the entirety of it and not take anything as self-explained and taken for granted. It's just, I think the courtesy of what the author should do. You should do at least an equal amount of work as the reader. So just a critique of writing here. Digital communication, however, is predominantly affect-based. It tends toward the immediate outpouring of affect. Twitter is an affective medium. I guess I kind of get that. And the politics based on it is an affective politics. Politics is reason and mediation. Maybe it would be better if we looked up affect to understand perhaps the nuance instead of just glossing over it. It's something in psychology having to do with emotions, but okay. So originating from the Latin influenced, late Middle English is attack as a disease. But okay, so one definition of affect, so A-F-F-E-C-T, is to pretend to have or feel something. But I don't think that's really the definition that he's using. Okay, here's the one that I was thinking of. In psychology, emotion or desire, especially influencing behavior or action. Okay, no. Sorry, I was looking at my computer screen. I should screen share. Yeah, I still don't know the intention behind the word choice, but we'll move on since he doesn't explain. All right. Politics is reason and mediation. Reason, which is time intensive, is currently being replaced by immediate affect. So he's trying to use affect as a word that, has less depth, I guess. And I don't know what's wrong with emotions, but feelings, I don't know. It seems slightly arbitrary unless you defend your language choices. All right. I don't know why I'm so spicy today. Just, I don't know. I haven't eaten, so there we go. Or lunch, I guess. The neoliberal regime isolates people while, this is something else that I think would be interesting to look up. Neoliberalism versus liberal. All right. So Wikipedia says, neoliberalism is distinct from liberalism insofar as it does not advocate laissez-faire economic policy, but instead is highly constructivist and activates a strong state to bring about market-like reforms in every aspect of society. So neoliberalism would fit well with his critique of globalization and globalization. Okay, that's probably something that I need to research and know a little more solidly. All right, just because he uses it a lot, and it's common concept, I guess, in our world. All right, the neoliberal regime isolates people while at the same time invoking empathy. Interesting. So that sounds a little manipulative to me. Because it is a resonant body, however, ritual community, so switching back to the ideal, does not require empathy. The demand for empathy can be heard in particular in atomized society. So that's interesting, because I would think empathy is a very positive quality that would help mitigate the presence of narcissism, which he critiques. But he doesn't like empathy. The present hype surrounding the concept has primarily economic causes. Empathy is used as an efficient means of production. It serves the purpose of emotionally influencing and directing people. So maybe it's not empathy that's the problem, it's how it's used. The demand for empathy is the nuance. Under the neoliberal regime, a person is not only exploited during working hours, rather the whole person is exploited. In this context, emotional management turns out to be more effective than rational management. The former reaches deeper into a person than does the latter. Neoliberal psychopolitics attempts to elicit positive emotions and to exploit them. So this very much reminds me of Orwell's 1984 and Marxism, and just sort of the rhetoric that propaganda might use, be a hero, do this. Be selfless and do this for the common good. trying to point to or connect to certain values that people in our culture have internalized and kind of accept as being ideal and pious, and saying that, well, you are going to be good if you do this. It's kind of like, just to bring it down to a relational level, this can happen, I think, in toxic relationships. I remember at one point in my earlier years, when I was in a complicated relationship, let's say, I was about to say friends, but to be more honest, a complicated relationship. I think we were friends at the time. And this person said to me, why don't you call me more? If you don't call me every day, then you are not a good friend. And so it was kind of manipulative, because then the reaction is, I mean, I'm not a good friend. That sounds horrible. I want to be a good friend, but I don't have time to call you every day because you're not in that position in my life where I would want to spend my time doing that. And so it's the conflation of like, what you get to say is good is really what you just want me to do as a form of control. So governments can do that. And interesting that, just skipping trying to convince you by logic, by the rational, because it says in this context, emotional management turns out to be more effective than rational management. So forget about trying to convince you by just logic and reason. It's easier to manipulate someone and sway them more effectively and efficiently by their emotions. The former reaches deeper into a person than does the latter. Neoliberal psychopolitics, sorry if I'm repeating, attempts to elicit positive emotions and to exploit them. In the final analysis, it is freedom itself that is here being exploited. In this respect, neoliberal psychopolitics differs from the biopolitics of industrial modernity, and the modern modernity is very much a historical term, and I guess we are in the postmodern or beyond that, which operates through disciplinary compulsion and command. So, it's the power that's being exerted, he says, is not even explicit in something that's, kind of aggressive and objectively out there, which would be more, I guess, helpful to those who are, oppressed, because it would be more obvious. But Byung-Chul Han really has this idea, and he picks it up in What is Power, that ultimate power is, or ultimately effective power and malicious power, I would say, is more subtle, so you don't know what's happening. And this is very much, if I remember back from my grad school days, an idea of Foucault. Digital communication is increasingly developing into communication without community. The neoliberal regime encourages communication without community by isolating everyone as the producer of him or herself. So maybe it's like we're talking, but we're not really listening to each other, establishing a relationship or anything meaningful that can be productive to liberate us. Producing is derived from the Latin verb producere, meaning presenting or making visible. Like the French produire, maybe? No, that's probably not right. It still carries the meaning of presenting. Why are you making me do this? This is why I'm studying French. So I won't get caught up. How would you say that? C'est produire? that doesn't sound right, means to play to the gallery. The colloquial German expression sich produzieren probably has the same etymology. Today, we are constantly and compulsively playing to the gallery. This is especially the case, for instance, on social media. The social is coming to be completely subordinated to self-production. Everyone is producing him or herself in order to garner more attention. So, kind of close to saying the self is commodity. The compulsion of self-production leads to a crisis of community. The so-called community that is today invoked everywhere is an atrophied community, perhaps even a kind of commodified and consumerized community. It lacks the symbolic power to bind people together. And I think that's true. If you are trying to create yourself as a brand, you're trying to attract and speak to people, you're becoming sort of a monolith. You know, how when I was starting my Instagram, I was really struggling with how to make because I think most of us authentically are not monolithic. We're kind of scattered. We have lots of different interests. Our moods change constantly. And we're not, it's difficult to put ourselves in a box and objectify ourselves, you know? And as much as I tried, I could not use one single filter or use a particular color scheme because I was just different every day and I liked something different. And, you know, and also I'm lazy. So, you know, as much as I might have liked to at some point, making myself as a brand, I could not do it. And I'm so scattered, so I would also end up making like 2 or 3 Instagrams or 2 or 3 Twitters because like I have so many different sides that I like. There's the bookish side, there's the philosophy side or literature side, the philosophy side, the religious studies side, and I don't know. So it's more chaotic. People are complicated and nuanced and chaotic. And also, I think he's saying this is because when you are putting yourself in that position where you're trying to attract people and increase your numbers, etc., then are you going to be making actual relationships? It's no longer about wanting to create a sense of community or belongingness because you have something else at stake, which is having a successful brand. And if so many of us are trying to do this so we can get out of being a work slave or whatever it is and work for ourselves, it's like, can we end up doing that after we get through the muddy part of performing? Or, you know, which I don't think is, I mean, he's trying to combine all these conversations. So how does that go back to the ritual? Will rituals save us? I don't know, because I think you can have rituals and this sort of commodified society. It's just, it maybe takes pauses in rituals. So I don't know. So maybe he'll reconcile those 2 lines of conversations. Or maybe I was going off on, you know, a little caveat. All right. Communication without, and that's really interesting too, because the etymological root of or meaning of religion is to bind, so to bring together. And he's talking about religions, the sacred, the divine, rituals, etc., and in connection with community. And a lot of people stay in religion not just for the comfort that the belief gives, but for the communal aspect. You know, you're meeting every Sunday or every Saturday or, you know, whatever your religion is. And I'm just coming from a Protestant Christian background. So that's the first example that my mind goes to. You know, and you have get-togethers and you don't have to be invited to them. You're just automatically included in all of that, and you're working together towards something, and you know, it's a really nice social time. For all the critique of religions and bad things that sometimes come out of it, of the tradition. Problematic. Communication without community can be accelerated because it is additive. Rituals, by contrast, are narrative processes that do not allow for acceleration. So the slowing down is what he wants. Symbols stand still. This is not the case with information. Information exists by circulating. Stillness only means that communication ceases, stands still. It does not produce anything. In the post-industrial age, sorry, I just had a thought. I think that's what I am so compelled toward academia, because it is one of those realms where, in some sense, branding yourself and self-promotion and some of the negative aspects of consumerism and capitalism can't touch. And I realize there's a whole conversation of how expensive college is, for instance. But once you get into the classroom, there's not any manipulation. There's really just, you know, the professor doesn't have to try to get students in their class, not really, or promote their classes. It's already kind of done, right? Students will filter in, they have to take certain classes, or they want to take certain classes. And we're just trying to figure things out together in a somewhat democratic, but also structured way. And yes, there is the power dynamic. Your professor grades you, gives you feedback, but really in the sense of trying to help move you along with whatever knowledge they have. And it's a very sort of, it's not a reciprocal relationship exactly, but it's, but I think it's a generous sort of, I mean, because when you get into a classroom, a college classroom, you know, it can be about government or politics or history or whatever, but the tone and the level of conversation is very different from that in, let's say, media or just the public in general. It's as if everyone kind of agrees to, and it doesn't have to just happen in academia or a college classroom. I think wonderfully now, and there needs to be communities, like let's just stick with philosophy groups like on Meetup, those are free, right? Kind of. I mean, I think that someone has to pay something, so there might be some dues or donations or something like that, but on the whole, it's not very expensive if you do have to do that with your Meetup group. And I'm talking about meetup.com. Or on Twitter, there are Twitter spaces, or, you know, there are different sort of places where you can have this same kind of generous effect where everyone's trying to figure out things and learn, and it's not based on profit or performance, in the sense that, although he likes performance concerning rituals, again, this is my own caveat, I guess, it's sort of these, I think, relatively pure spaces. All right, where was I? The compulsion of production brings with it the compulsion to perform well. Performance differs. Okay, so here's, it's not what, it's how. To keep reminding myself of that too. Performance differs from labor in libido economical terms. In the case of labor, the ego need not take center stage. In the case of performance, however, the ego relates specifically to itself. It produces an object, it produces itself. Someone who is absorbed by object libido does not produce, but rather exhausts him or herself. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out, because he goes back and forth between what he's critiquing and what he's, you know, arguing for, and I don't know why, I'm just lost here. The compulsion of production so the problematic thing, brings with it the compulsion to perform well. Okay. Performance differs from labor. So where does labor come from? In libido economical terms. Because see, it seems like the first sentence was talking about perform in the negative aspect. And then the sentence after that, like we're back to the performance of rituals. I mean, I don't know. I guess I can't keep up. Okay. In the case of labor, the ego need not take center stage. In the case of performance, however, the ego relates specifically to itself. It not only produces an object, it produces itself. Someone who is absorbed by object libido does not produce, but rather exhausts himself or herself. I don't know, I'll just go on. The narcissistic relation to the self constitutes the performance. The ego libido rules over the performing subject. The better it performs, the more ego it gains. Freud, we know, associated the ego libido with the death drive. The narcissistic subject of performance breaks apart because of a fatal accumulation of ego libido. It exploits itself voluntarily and passionately until it breaks down. It optimizes itself to death. Its failing is called depression or burnout. Okay. In a society governed by ritual, there is no depression. I always have maybe a slight hesitation when philosophers or people in the mindfulness, spiritual, contemplative movement talk about various mental conditions, because perhaps some readers have an experience of being diagnosed with something like depression or ADHD, or I'm thinking about Eckhart Tolle. He talks about schizophrenia. Like, for instance, this sounds like when Eckhart Tolle talks about schizophrenia and says that it would be erased from society if we would have a certain mindset. And that seems like maybe you should define the kind of, because we have, sort of maybe general depression that everyone might experience. But then we do have people who are diagnosed with depression, and it can't be like tricked out of you by like positive thinking, right? So I get a little uncomfortable. Like, I think early, sorry, early in the chapter, he talked about ADHD. It was basically saying to me that none of us would be ADHD if we could just have rituals in our lives and slow down. So I don't know. I just don't know if we should try to comment outside of our fields like that. So, but that's fine. Let's just pretend he's talking in generally. And maybe he is. He just should say it. Okay, so in such a society, the soul is fully absorbed by ritual forms. It is even emptied out. Rituals contain aspects of the world, and they produce in us a strong relationship to the world. Depression, by contrast, is based on an excessive relation to self, wholly incapable of leaving the self behind. Incapable of leaving the self behind, of transcending ourselves and relating to the world, we withdraw into our shells. The world disappears. We circle around ourselves, tortured by feelings of emptiness. Rituals, by contrast, disburden the ego of the self, de-psychologizing and de-internalizing the ego. I mean, just to give, writers the benefit of the doubt, I think maybe there's a point to some extent for some people. But I don't think we can generalize. I already said it, so it's fine. Hierarchies and power relations are often inscribed by rituals. So here is another sort of provocatively conservative statement, right? Because at the same time, he's kind of giving like a Marxist critique of neoliberalism. There is a use for hierarchies and power and order and value. So, and this is the interesting thing, this is what I like about philosophy, is that you can be complicated and, I don't know, paradoxical. By means of their aesthetic aspects, rituals can also lend a certain aura to domination, but they are, in essence, symbolic practices of making at home in the world. Roland Barthes also conceives of rituals and ceremonies from the perspective of making at home in the world. They protect us, he says, against the abysses of being. Ceremony protects like a house, something that allows one to live in one's feelings. Example, mourning. The ceremony of mourning acts like a varnish, protects, insulates the skin against the atrocious burns of mourning. When there are no rituals to act as protective measures, life is wholly unprotected. The compulsion of production cannot cope with this transcendental lack of protection and lack of being at home, which it ultimately exacerbates. All right, so that's the end of chapter 1. How many chapters are there in here? There's 10. So yeah, let me know if you want me to go through the entire book, because I will, but I at least will go through the next chapter. I think it'll be an interesting for me to try to relate to Heidegger. All right, thank you everyone for sticking with, and I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever it is for you. Thanks to any of my students who were listening. If I go through the whole book, you will have read or listened to, you know, one of your first, at least, I would think, philosophy books. All right, thanks everyone.